What if a single photo could rewrite American history? A mysterious 100-year-old Civil War photo was found in a dusty attic. But when experts zoomed in, everything changed. Faces no one could explain. Technology is decades ahead of its time, and one silent figure standing between Lincoln and Grant, who was never meant to be seen. Who was he? Why did Lincoln trust him? In this video, we dive into the photo that shook historians, stunned archivists, and revealed a secret hidden for over a century. What you're about to see isn't just a picture, it's a buried legacy. The photo that shouldn't exist. It started with a trunk, old leather straps, brass latch, barely holding together after decades of dust and heat in the attic of Claire Donovan's family home. She hadn't even planned to open it that day. She was just cleaning, organizing, maybe looking for a few antiques worth salvaging. But what she found instead wasn't just valuable. It was something no one could explain. Inside the trunk, she found what you'd expect. Railroad bonds, lace gloves, faded letters, and a few scattered buttons. Then her hand brushed against something firmer. A leather photo album, cracked at the spine, its corners curling like dry leaves. Most of the images inside were black and white portraits, stiff poses, blank faces, all typical of the late 1800s, all except one. Tucked near the back of the album was a single photograph, sealed in wax paper. Unlike the others, this one had weight to it. Thicker stock, sealed edges, and a faint scent that Claire couldn't quite place. Tobacco? Glue? Something old and strange. She didn't open it immediately, not until the room was clean, the dust gone, and her curiosity unbearable. Claire pulled back the wax sleeve, and her breath caught in her throat. There, in haunting clarity, was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was dressed in a black frock coat, his unmistakable top hat tilted in the sunlight to the extreme right of the frame. Beside him, an empty wooden chair was placed, with several high-ranking Union officers around him in mid-conversation, with drawn sabers at their sides, making General Ulysses S. Grant and General George Meade part of history. But not so much for Claire. It took the color to shake her hands. Not hand coloring, no tinting or painting after the fact. This was all in full color, deep blue Union uniforms, the dusty brown of the boots, the wood grain of the chair, even the creases in Lincoln's black suit catching subtle light. Like a modern photograph disguised as a 19th century print. The caveat? Color photography was impossible in 1865. Claire knew the photograph wasn't ordinary and took it to the only person she could trust, Professor George Kramer, the Civil War photography historian who had once guest lectured at her university. When he first laid eyes on the print, he didn't utter a word, but leaned in closer, his hands trembling. "You need to tell me exactly where you found this," he said in a low voice. Claire narrated the attic, the trunk, the wax paper, everything she could recall. Kramer did not blink. Instead, he pointed to the paper stock and said something that made her heart race. "That is albumen silver print from the 1860s. There is no way it should hold color." She asked the obvious question, "So, is it fake?" Kramer said in a low voice, as if the color had left his face, "No, that's the scary part. It's not fake." He arranged for experts at the New York Historical Society to analyze the photo for confirmation. There, Kramer with Claire examined the image under high-resolution equipment with a forensic imaging specialist and a paper conservator. What the lab had to say took the breath away. The pigments were not applied after printing, but in fact embedded into the photo itself. A process similar to early Kodachrome, but one that predates it by half a century. Unbelievable as it sounds, So confirmed the scanner. Color dyes, organic pigments, and photochemistry all dated back to some time in the 1860s. This not only violated the rules of photography but also those of history itself. Claire, however, had eyes for something else. Not the technology by which the experts were still toiling, standing slim between Lincoln and Grant. A figure not found among Civil War archives or officer rosters. An anonymous fellow was barred from identification by Claire through the historical roster, but not from his face. What she would see next would lead to a closely guarded family legacy going back through a century of buried history. But the real mystery wasn't the color. It was who was standing between Lincoln and Grant. The man in the middle. The photo had already shocked everyone in the lab. The clarity, the color, the impossible chemistry. But while the others pored over pigments and paper stock, Claire couldn't take her eyes off the man between Lincoln and Grant. He wasn't like the others. The officers stood stiffly, decked out in well-earned stripes and ceremonial sabers. But this figure appeared understated. No rank displayed, no name she could match to known Civil War portraits. He wore a uniform, yes, but it lacked insignia. His expression? Focused, steady, as if he weren't merely part of the photo, but part of something else entirely. Then it hit her. Claire had seen this face before, not in a textbook or an archive, but in a much later photograph from her family collection. She jerked up a scan on her phone, a 1912 image of a man standing outside a barn, one hand resting on a dog's head. He was older and heavier, dressed like a farmer, but the jawline, the ears, the slight slope of the eyebrows, it was him, the same man, standing beside Abraham Lincoln nearly 50 years earlier. "That should be my great-great-grandfather," Claire whispered. Professor Kramer looked up sharply. "What?" She insisted on having him on the phone. Kramer leaned toward it, brow furrowed as he moved back and forth between the two images. "He doesn't seem to show in any record for the Civil War," Kramer muttered more to himself than with any intent to include her. "Could be a volunteer, maybe even a civilian caught in uniform." Much shaking of heads followed. "No, William Donovan, I remember. There were some stories told by my grandfather. His grandfather had served in the Civil War, but had disappeared before it was over. No more particulars, just that he did not come back, otherwise listed as missing in action." She opened her computer and began searching for Civil War service records. Minutes later, Donovan, William found, rank medics, Regiment 104th New York Infantry. Status, missing in action. Last seen 6th April, 1865. One entry, one note, no explanations given. Kramer still held his gaze on the screen. April 6, just 3 days before Lee's surrender. And Claire slowly nodded. So, if he disappeared on April 6th, how does he picture himself on the day of April 9th? With Lincoln? At Appomattox? Kramer didn't answer. He was already busy digging through his own laptop, furiously typing away. A few moments later, he glanced up. There are no known photographs of Lincoln at Appomattox, only engravings, sketches, and letters. But if it really would be the first image to capture it, Claire felt ludicrously proud, then equally terrified. Could it prove that her great-great-grandfather was more than the battlefield medic, or just at the wrong place at the wrong time? But if it was purposely framing him, if some mushroom had placed him in that photo with ill will, then someone else had made sure the world forgot. That did feel more than accidental. Erased records, vague family rumors, and a photo probably never meant for survival. But silence around Donovan was not some historical forgetfulness. It felt curated, constructed. Some much greater machinery had been set into motion in preparation for burying him until now. She suddenly remembered a very old letter her grandfather used to show her, yellowed with age and barely readable. It had been written by William Donovan and was dated decades after the end of the war. But one line stood out: "If ever you find the photograph with the chair, burn it." It was never meant to be kept. Did it in a flash. This picture was not simply the object of a bygone time. It was hazardous. That which is actually hazardous is plain to see. The air around her felt denser now, heavily loaded with the knowledge that nothing in history had ever been so stable as it seemed. The laboratory team showered its attentions elsewhere, not Lincoln or Grant. Rather, they attended to the man in between, the one that history forsook. Not gone, but hidden. Not obliterated, but craftily brought to non-existence. And now, with the advent of the photograph, a re-emergent subject introduces the one question rarely spoken of: why? If William Donovan was declared missing, what was he doing beside Abraham Lincoln in a photo dated after his disappearance? Lincoln's hidden network. At first glance, William Donovan was an anomaly, standing silently in the most historically loaded moment of the Civil War, yet missing from every known roster. No military title, no promotion records, not even a death notice. Just a quiet footnote: missing in action, April 6, 1865. But what if he wasn't missing at all? Back at the New York Historical Society lab, Professor Kramer dug deeper into War Department archives. Late that evening, he called Claire with a voice tight from hours of reading. "I found something," he said. "You need to get down here now." When Claire arrived, Kramer didn't waste time. He pulled up a rarely accessed field record from April 1865. It was just one line in a broader memo. W.D. moved to shadow post per Al's request. Not to be logged. No weapons drawn unless required. Claire blinked. "What's W.D.?" "War Department," replied Kramer. "And Al, that's most likely Lincoln." It was a nickname some of his closest aides used in private communications. The room went dead silent. What had begun as a misfiled photograph was now attached to an official document suggesting something uncommon among historians: that in his last days, Lincoln may have created an informal Shadow Unit 1 operating outside the public military hierarchy. One that included such men as William Donovan. As they continued to comb through records, another nugget turned up: a field journal that referred to temporary escorts assigned for sensitive movement between command zones selected outside normal rank. These men had nobody of badges and no papers, only quiet orders to stand watch, report silently, and protect key figures, including the president. Claire was utterly dumbfounded. "So you're saying that Lincoln built his own network, that is, a team outside the official military?" Kramer nodded. "There have always been rumors, but I've never seen anything more concrete than this." The most damning proof came not in words, but in the fabric. Elsa, the forensic imaging specialist, was adjusting the scan from the photo when she froze at Donovan's coat. "There's something here," she said as she zoomed in slowly on the collar of his uniform. There was a tiny, meticulously stitched patch hidden underneath the fold of his jacket's lapel, mostly out of sight. Faint and worn, but quite identifiable. It read, "PEC." Kramer leaned in. "Presidential Escort Committee." Elsa went pale. "That doesn't exist." "Not officially," said Kramer, "but there have been mentions of it in passing. Coded communications, personal diaries from Lincoln's aides. The theory was that near the end of his presidency, Lincoln didn't trust his cabinet fully. He wanted to have some eyes and ears in the field, people who would report directly to him. The badge on Donovan's lapel was more than just a pretty detail. It was a touchstone, irrefutable evidence that he had not disappeared from view in the waning days of the war, but had been reassigned and removed from his regiment and placed at Lincoln's side by Lincoln himself. But more questions arose. Why was this committee operational in secret? Why were its members undocumented? And why was Donovan allowed such prominence in the photo before fading into obscurity? Kramer leaned back, rubbed his eyes some more. Lincoln knew the war was coming to an end, but the peace had always teetered. He needed trustworthy people at that last moment, not generals, not politicians, ghosts. Ghosts like William Donovan. It was then that the strange placement of the empty wooden chair in the photograph suddenly took on a new meaning. Not merely a prop, but a marker, a space deliberately kept open, for danger, for decisions, for a moment when someone like Donovan might step in should things turn sour. Had Claire not looked closely enough, history might have missed it all. But the mystery had just begun to unravel, for swathed beneath the patch on Donovan's uniform lay the secret message, one line that would send chills down the spine of anyone who laid eyes upon it. But hidden deeper beneath that badge was a chilling message stitched by hand. The message that changed everything. The image had already cracked open questions about lost networks, secret assignments, and an unknown figure planted beside Abraham Lincoln. But as the team at the New York Historical Society lab continued their analysis, a new discovery shifted the weight of the photo from mysterious to chilling. It started with a closer look at William Donovan's uniform. Elsa, the forensic imaging expert, was scanning the lapel when something strange caught her eye. "Wait," she said, pausing mid-click. "There's more stitching here. Not just the badge." Beneath the tiny peck insignia, stitched into the dark wool of the Union coat, was a sliver of thread, so faint it nearly blended into the fabric. It wasn't just a loose thread or a repair. It was deliberate. A stitched message. Elsa adjusted the spectral scanner and zoomed in. There it was, hidden in plain sight. A few careful words sewn with thread just one shade lighter than the jacket. "Target verified. Stand until April 14th. The room went still. April 14th, 1865, the night President Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater. Claire stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. "Are you saying he knew?" No one responded right away. Kramer simply leaned over Elsa's shoulder, staring at the screen as if trying to will the words into meaning something else. But there was no misreading it. If true, the message seemed to indicate that William Donovan Clare's great-great-grandfather was not only apprised of a threat to Lincoln's life, but also was perhaps assigned to track or guard Lincoln until that very date. The date of Lincoln's death. "Target verified" doesn't sound like routine patrol language, Mason, the paper conservator, at last said. "That sounds like an assignment." "And stand until," Elsa admitted, "suggests he was given a duration, not a location. He was close to Lincoln and was possibly involved in a final line of defense. Worse, he could have been a silent witness to a threat that materialized just before he could act. Suddenly, it didn't seem like a tragedy for him to disappear from all records. It was a cover-up. Claire remembered Donovan's old letter warning, "If you ever find the photo with the chair, burn it." Now it made sense, so terrible that it could have wilted the strongest heart. The photo was not mere evidence of nunc absentia, but proof of knowledge, of forewarning, and maybe failure. What made the discovery all the more shocking, however, was the timing of it. The earlier archive memo said that Donovan had just been transferred to the Shadow Post 3 days before Lee's surrender on April 9th. That picture had barely recorded him mid-assignment. Alive, present, assigned to stand down by April 14th. But there was no further documentation of him after that. "He was to have stopped it," Claire whispered. Kramer did not answer. There were too many contingencies. Perhaps Donovan had the means to foil a plot, and yet did not. Perhaps he was waiting for orders that never came. Perhaps, darker yet, he was put out of the way before he had a chance to do anything about it. This much was certain. Someone had stitched that message onto his jacket. He was gone, knowing all too well what was about to happen. Whether it was for him only, or perhaps left as a breadcrumb in case anything went wrong, is hard to say. But that photograph, once dismissed as a curious artifact, had now converted into something entirely different. But the message also raised a terrifying possibility. Was Donovan silenced before he could act? The technology that shouldn't be. For days, the focus had been on the faces in the photo: Lincoln, Grant, Meade, and the mysterious William Donovan. But after the secret message beneath Donovan's lapel was revealed, Elsa, the forensic imaging expert, turned her attention to something just as baffling: the photo itself. From the very beginning, everyone had agreed it was strange, too clear, too detailed, too modern. The color alone defied explanation. Civil War photography, by every standard, was black and white. Color photography hadn't even been theorized until the 1890s, and certainly not executed until decades after that. So how was this possible? Elsa ran the image through another layer of spectral scanning, this time isolating the photo's pigment data. And what she found pushed the mystery to an entirely new level. "It isn't hand-tinted," she said. "I thought it perhaps had been post-printed in color, but these pigments are in the emulsion itself. They were baked into the photograph at the time of development." There was silence. "Not possible," muttered Mason Lee, who was the conservator for paper. "The Albaman silver stock from the 1860s cannot take chromogenic dyes. It is not chemically engineered for that." Elsa nodded slowly. "And yet, somehow, this one does." Her report broke down the analysis. Layers of gum arabic, animal-based binding agents, and most shocking of all, organic pigments that included beetroot and indigo. Both were used in dyeing cloth in the 19th century, but were never documented in early photography. Mixed with oil-reactive compounds and exposed to light in a controlled bath, the chemicals appeared to jointly bind just long enough to hold color under very particular conditions. It was clearly an experimental hybrid, too complicated for the general public, too gentle to replicate. And yet, here it was. But how on earth? Claire stared dumbfounded at the screen. "This wasn't just a photo," she murmured. "This was a prototype." Kramer nodded. "Looks like it." Going through unappreciated historical accounts, Elsa discovered something even stranger. O'Sullivan's assistant's archived journal entry dated 1866. O'Sullivan is often regarded as one of the finest photographers of the Civil War days. He used a small group of assistants in his duties during war assignments. The journal entry said, "The president requested one unique chromatic plate for his legacy image. There shall be no demonstration. A private development is advised." Such an old image. That metaphor lit the room. Kramer took it one step farther. Lincoln wasn't a man who obsessed himself with vanity, but he was a man who obsessed himself with meaning, with the preservation of what mattered. If he, just per his own order, commissioned a photographic experiment, it meant to survive the erosion of history. It would wholly explain everything. This photograph was not for popular viewing. It was not battlefield propaganda. It was not a military archive, but a visual time capsule, wherein a photograph proved not only faces and uniforms as mere symbols, but also messages, techniques, and clues to the understanding of which only future generations would be privy. And who else is there to carry it than someone outside the record books? Someone who would have no audience, with none to tell, until safe to do so. William Donovan had stood quietly in the middle of the most powerful figures of the Union. But perhaps his true role wasn't just about protection. Maybe he was a carrier, the guardian of something bigger than himself. A photo engineered with purpose. A document concealing a president's final secrets in plain sight. But then, there was one more twist. If the photo were commissioned for secrecy, then why had Donovan kept it? Why had he asked his family to destroy it? Why, after a century, did it only resurface now? Claire didn't know, until she found the letter. A single page folded into the lining of the original photo album. A note signed simply, Al. The question wasn't whether the photo was real. It was why Lincoln wanted it made in the first place. The letter from Al. By now, Claire Donovan had accepted a truth few ever encounter. Her family had been holding on to a forgotten chapter of American history. Not a rumor, not a relic. A direct connection to Abraham Lincoln's final days, and to a secret network buried so deeply it barely existed on paper. But as astonishing as the photograph was, it wasn't the end. While re-examining the old leather album that had once held the color photo, Claire noticed something she'd missed. A fragile envelope, faded to beige and folded tightly into the back lining. There was no address, no formal marking, just a single name written in dark, slanted ink. To William. No surname, no return address, no postage. Inside was a letter, a handwritten one. The paper was dry but surprisingly well kept. The ink, while fading, was still legible. At the very bottom appeared a name that dried up Claire's throat. Al Kramer, gloved, picked up the letter and began to read it aloud. My dearest William, if nothing else came out of this war, it tells us that the truth is seldom of great interest to those who need it the most. You were chosen not to draw your sword, but to stand visible among those who do. Whatever we do with peace will challenge us far more than anything we did during the war. Thus, stand where they don't expect you. Watch who you need to. And if history gives you a miss, allow it to. I won't. Silence fell then, in the room. No last name, no stamp of sorts. But that letter's voice was unmistakable. The tone, the weight, the quiet authority woven into every word. This was not a general nor a politician. This sounded like the leader who was possibly very well aware of a price being paid for truth and how easily it could be erased. This letter was written by Abraham Lincoln. If that photo had been the riddle, this letter was the last piece of that puzzle. For it proved what all in the lab had begun to suspect, that William Donovan was more than just a medic or a misplaced soldier. He had been sent directly into the fray by the president. Not to fight, not to march, but to observe, to protect, to be at the edge of the shadows while others looked the other way. Stand visible among the ones who do resonated eerily with Donovan's central place in the photo flanked by Lincoln and Grant, yet is not labeled a single military archive. Not as an officer, not even as an aide. He was not meant to be known. The instruction was clear. If history forgets you, then let it. This is not merely a letter. This is a final directive, noted Kramer in an undertone. It explains everything. Why Donovan had been taken out of the military records, why he left no trace behind himself, and why his family believed him to be missing. He was not missing. He had been eliminated from existence, intentionally. As far as the world was concerned, he was never to be remembered. until now. And, perhaps most disturbingly, this explains why Donovan admonished his posterity several decades back in that note. Burn it if you ever find it. To keep that picture was to reveal the truth which Lincoln had entrusted him alone with. If Lincoln trusted Donovan so deeply, why did history erase him completely? Legacy buried in silence. When the story first broke of a Civil War photo in full color of a forgotten man standing beside Abraham Lincoln, historians didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't just because the image shattered known photographic timelines. It was because the story behind it did something even rarer. It revealed a piece of history no one had asked to find. But Claire Donovan knew the truth was never meant to stay buried. She declined every offer, from major networks, private collectors, even academic institutions, because the photo wasn't for sale. It had never been meant for that. This wasn't about headlines or documentaries or digital scans passed around for clicks. It was about something sacred, a promise made across generations, kept in silence, and finally brought into the light. Instead, Claire partnered with the New York Historical Society to create something more personal. A public exhibit that didn't glorify war or even focus on Lincoln. It was called The Man Who Stood Anyway. The centerpiece was a replica of the mysterious photograph, now enlarged to its full dimensions, encased in glass, and lit gently from behind. Visitors could finally see it all. Lincoln's tired eyes, the dust on the boots, the empty wooden chair, and the quiet man in the middle, William Donovan. Beside it stood a full biography panel, not one that had ever existed in textbooks, but one reconstructed through records, letters, and the photo itself. A timeline of his military service, his abrupt disappearance, the final War Department field note referencing the shadow post, and, of course, the letter from Al. Claire did not need to go that far. The truth was enthralling in itself. She had headed Lincoln's quote from the very letter in a print hanging across the wall right above the display. Above the chair modeled after one that used to be empty in that picture. Some men fight with swords, others with silence. And that, in the end, was Donovan's legacy. Not as a general, not as a war hero in the public eye. He was somebody who held something heavier than any rifle or saber, a secret. A burden of watchfulness and impotent waiting, while history happened all around him. Claire stood on the sidelines that first week of the exhibit. She stood there behind the throng of school groups, former soldiers and tourist skimmers passing through. Most had never heard of Donovan, but they stopped. And they hung around. Some read the letter twice. Others simply stared at the photograph in silence. She didn't need them to think of him as a hero. She needed them to see him. That was enough. Through all of it, his hidden orders, his unknown presence, the stitched message warning of April 14th, Donovan had done exactly what Lincoln asked of him. He stood where no one expected him. He watched when no one knew to look. And when the world moved on without him, he didn't ask to be remembered. But time, as it turns out, remembers in its own way. A single photo, a missing soldier, and a message too dangerous for history to remember. What would you do if you found proof that the past wasn't what we thought it was? Would you hide it or show the world? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out the next video popping up, where we dive into more historical mysteries that were never supposed to be found.